My name is Erich Ferrari. The Public Affairs Alliance of Iranian Americans, PAAIA, has asked me to do an educational video series on Iran sanctions and how they impact the Iranian American community. While this video series will provide answers on many common questions regarding Iranian sanctions and how they impact the Iranian American community, nothing in this video series should be construed as legal advice. If you have specific questions regarding how Iran sanctions may impact you, you should contact a licensed legal professional who has experience in dealing with the Office of Foreign Assets Control and is knowledgeable about U.S. economic sanctions targeting Iran. I think it surprises a lot of people that the maintaining of a bank account at any bank in Iran is actually considered a violation of the Iranian transactions and sanctions regulations. There's been some rumor spread around the community that you can't have bank accounts at certain government banks, but that other private banks are okay. It's actually not true. No U.S. person is allowed to maintain a bank account at an Iranian bank unless they have a license authorization from OFAC to do so. I've seen numerous examples in my practice where U.S. persons, be they citizens or green card holders, go to Iran either for a vacation or for an extended stay with family and find that their U.S. bank accounts are blocked. Why is this? Well, U.S. banks are under the same regulations that other U.S. persons are. Therefore, they can't export any services to parties in Iran. Even as a U.S. person, once you go to Iran, they are not allowed to export the service of holding the bank account for you. As such, U.S. banks will block those accounts until such time as you return from Iran or you leave Iran. In this scenario, what this person would need to do is first voluntarily self-disclose their bank account in Iran. Why is that? Because that in and of itself is a violation, and there's tremendous benefits that can be had by self-disclosing your violation as opposed to OFAC finding out about it separately. Once that self-disclosure has been made, a license application should be submitted to the licensing division of OFAC in order to obtain authorization to maintain the account until such funds can be transferred out of the account to the United States and thereafter close the bank account. Yes, this activity would be prohibited. And there's two types of prohibitions which are implicated here. First, the signing of the power of attorney over to the aunt and her subsequent opening of the account and placement of funds into that account in which he has an interest is prohibited facilitation. Facilitation is a concept which states that no U.S. person can carry out an act which allows for two foreign persons to engage in an activity which would have been prohibited were the U.S. person directly involved. In short, you can't do anything that allows someone else to do something you couldn't do yourself. Second, you have a prohibited investment. Although the account is in the aunt's name, the funds belong to the U.S. person. As such, having her put it in an account where he can gain interest, albeit not in his name, would still be considered a prohibited investment and in violation of 560-207. Yes, this transaction is prohibited. Again, we're dealing with a permanent legal resident, which means she's a U.S. person. That U.S. person characterization carries with her wherever she goes in the world. As such, even though she's in Turkey, she's still bound by the prohibitions of the Iranian transactions and sanctions regulations. As such, maintenance of any bank account in Iran would require an OFAC-specific license authorization. Well, if we're talking about the Iranian transactions and sanctions regulations, there's generally two types of penalties that can be incurred. These penalties are derived from the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is the underlying statutory authority for the Iranian transactions and sanctions regulations. Under that authority, you have two categories of penalties. You have civil penalties and you have criminal penalties. Civil penalties include up to $250,000 in fines or twice the value of the transaction, whichever is greater. Remember, that's per transaction. Criminal penalties, which are imposed if it's found that the violation was willful in nature, carry up to 20 years in prison and up to $1 million in criminal fines. There are a number of ways OFAC can discover a violation of the Iranian transactions and sanctions regulations. The most common way is through receipt of a suspicious activity report. A suspicious activity report could be filed by a U.S. depository institution and indicate that some suspicious activity occurred on your account, which could further evidence a violation of the Iranian transactions and sanctions regulations. Another common way that OFAC finds out is through voluntary self-disclosures. Sometimes those disclosures come through formal voluntary self-disclosures filed with the Office of Enforcement, and sometimes they come through representations made in OFAC license applications. A third way is through information shared by other law enforcement agencies. For example, the FBI is investigating Person A, but in the course of their investigation discover evidence of sanctions violations by a Person B. They then take that information and they provide it to OFAC. A fourth way is through anonymous sources. So for example, Person A calls OFAC and provides an anonymous tip on Person B's activities, which could evidence a violation of the Iranian transactions and sanctions regulations. A final way is through open source research. For example, take Person A again, maybe they have some information on their Facebook account, their Twitter account, or some other social media platform, which evidences a potential violation of the Iranian transaction sanctions regulations. OFAC becomes aware of that information and then initiates an investigation to determine whether a violation has actually occurred or not. The factual scenarios can go on forever. The important thing to note here is that there's a U.S. nexus in all of these transactions. Either there's a U.S. citizen or permanent legal resident involved, U.S. goods or services are involved, or you have a U.S. company involved. If you have the U.S. nexus and you have a transaction with a sanctioned jurisdiction such as Iran, there's a high likelihood that that transaction is prohibited and can constitute an OFAC violation. Again, everything that we've said in this video today is informative in nature and should not be construed as legal advice. If you have specific questions, contact a licensed legal professional with experience in dealing with OFAC and who's knowledgeable about the OFAC regulations. Thank you.